Hello. After I posted the last video regarding 3I Atlas, the third interstellar interloper in the solar system, I received a few direct messages and some media questions about some of the claims that Avi Loeb has been making regarding this being a potentially alien techno-signature. Now, um, Avi has helpfully listed the 8 reasons why he thinks this object might be of alien origin on a Medium post. So what I thought I would do was just go through the 8 different reasons and try and explain why I don't think they add up, frankly. So the first reason that Loeb gives is that the trajectory of 3I Atlas brings it in very close to the plane of the ecliptic. So for those not in the know, the plane of the ecliptic is the plane in which all of the planets of the solar system rotate around the sun. And Loeb correctly notes that 3I Atlas is approaching within about 5 degrees of that plane. He then goes on to say that this is highly unlikely and, essentially could be signs that the object was directed. Now, there's a few problems with that. One is essentially a logical one. If your alien civilization is in a particular direction, the easiest way to get to our solar system is to be coming from straight in that direction. And so just because it's coming in the plane, what if the civilization is, above or below the plane of the solar system? Is he suggesting that the spacecraft sort of came down towards the solar system, went out all the way to the distant solar system, turned around, and then started approaching from in the plane? It just doesn't make sense, does it? So the fact that it approaches close to the plane, I think, can easily be explained as being down to just simple chance. We've had 3 of these objects so far. 2 of them came from almost, directly above the plane of the solar system, plunging in, down, and then through the solar system. This one's coming in from the side. I think once we've built up a larger number of these objects that we've detected, we will find that either they'll just come in essentially randomly from all directions, or there may well be a preferred direction they'll come from, or at least a preferred plane that they come from, which will do something like align with the plane of the Milky Way, which itself is offset relative to the plane of the ecliptic. I should also note, for this particular reason, it's also directly counter to what Avi Loeb himself had claimed back when he was claiming that the first interstellar object, 1I Oumuamua, was an interstellar object. In that situation, Oumuamua was coming down from on top of the solar system. At that time, he claimed that that was evidence that Oumuamua must have been an alien spacecraft. So you can't really have it both ways. You can't have it that coming down from above is signs that it's aliens, coming from the sides is signs that it's aliens. Basically, it coming in any direction is a sign that it's an alien spacecraft. The second claim that Loeb relies on is the fact that 3I Atlas is observed to have this phenomenon called an anti-tail, which is simply that when you look at a comet, its tail almost always points directly away from the sun, because the tail is essentially being pushed away by the light pressure of the light from the sun. But 3I Atlas is observed to have a tail, at least initially, which was projecting towards the sun, the so-called anti-tail. Now, part of the confusion here is that there's actually 2 different types of anti-tail. The first type, the most common type, is actually just essentially an optical illusion. It's a projection effect caused by the relative positions of the comet, its tail, and the Earth, and it just makes it look like it's projecting in front of the comet. So that's not what's going on here, and Avi Loeb said that and is quite right. This really does have material or jet of material that was coming out from the front of the comet, at least earlier on when it was further from the sun. Now, the interesting thing about this particular claim, that it might be a sign of aliens, is that Loeb has himself written a paper which explains why this phenomenon can happen due to just basic normal physics. He's actually describing a phenomenon that's been known about for at least 50 years. There are papers going back to the 70s where they describe essentially the same process. And essentially what the idea is that the front side of the comet, the one facing the sun, is the one that's getting bathed in sunlight and therefore warms up, and therefore it can preferentially eject material forwards as this forward-facing part of the comet warms up. And if the particles of the dust and the, say, ice particles are massive enough, they will get ejected forward in front of the comet and they'll sort of drift off in front of the comet. But because they're so heavy, it's hard for the sunlight to start pushing them back. It takes a while. And so what you see in that situation, which we have seen for several comets in the solar system before, is that you will get one of these anti-tails at a certain distance from the sun, but as the comet approaches closer and closer and closer to the sun, the light pressure eventually begins to push that anti-tail backwards until it's all pushed back and joins and forms essentially the normal tail pointing diametrically away from the sun. So it's kind of strange that Avi Loeb is using the observation of a phenomenon that he then explains as natural as evidence that this thing is aliens, but, you know, he does. So that's one of his reasons. The third reason Loeb uses to justify that this thing might be of alien origin is that it is considerably more massive than the first two interstellar interlopers we discovered. I'll be honest with you, I really don't get what the argument here is. This thing being more massive than them does not strike me as a sign that aliens built it. If anything, you know, building spacecraft, you need them to be as light as possible. And so from a logic point of view, that's a bit of a problem. But the other big problem is simply that it's bigger than those two objects, but it's considerably smaller than the biggest comets in the solar system. So it's not like it's unfeasibly large. It's quite a normal size for a comet. So I just genuinely don't understand what the purpose of that argument is. It's bigger than two other interstellar objects, neither of which were aliens. So why does that imply it's the result of aliens? I don't know. The fourth argument that Loeb makes is that the arrival of the comet in the inner solar system was timed to coincide with the positions of several of the inner solar system planets being in the right place so that it could pass reasonably close to them. And reasonably is still a stretch because it's, you know, there's still vast distances. Again, I have a bunch of problems with this. The logical one of you've just traveled all the way through deep space, so you're going to hang around in the outer solar system for a while before you plunge in at just the right time, when you could presumably choose, if you're, you know, a well-designed alien space probe, to take a more leisurely route into the inner solar system and see more of the solar system. The other problem I have is just, it's again a sort of post hoc statistical argument where he comes up with a unfeasibly small percentage chance of this happening, which is based on you essentially picking that distribution and saying how often will that happen at random. Well, you know, it depends on what factors you are deciding to clump into that measurement. So for example, it just ignores the fact that this thing gets nowhere near the outer solar system planets. You know, they're not included. We're not including the fact that it completely misses Neptune, Uranus, and Saturn for some reason, and doesn't get very close to the Earth, frankly. So to me, it just seems logically unsound and statistically not really justifiable. So his fifth argument is just that the chemical makeup of the material that's coming off the comet seems to be unusual when compared to your typical run-of-the-mill solar system comet. And in general, that's fairly true. But I think it's really, really important to note here that that is exactly what we expect. This thing did not form in our solar system. It formed in a completely different star system, potentially at a completely different time in the history of our galaxy's evolution. So it might have formed 3 or 4 billion years before our solar system was ever born. And if it did, then the galaxy would have had less time to enrich in metals due to the lives and deaths in particular of stars producing more and more of the heavier chemical elements. And so we would expect the chemical makeup of the star system it came from to be distinct from our solar system, and that would lead any comets formed there to themselves to be chemically different to ours. So the fact that it is anomalous, that it's a bit unusual compared to solar system comets, actually that's what we expect to see. The other thing to note is that a lot of the anomalous sort of measurements compared to solar system comets or solar system objects are quite strange when compared to your average solar system object, but there's often a solar system object you can find that has similar or even more extreme values than this thing has. So although it's on the edge of what's normal for our solar system, it's still in general within the bounds of what solar system comets will exhibit. And again, like I say, it came from a different star system. We fully expect it to be a bit weird. There's nothing about the mixtures of material that are coming off that make you go, well, that's coming from a machine or something made by intelligence. It's the same elements and the same sort of molecules and chemical composition in general that we see in comets in the solar system. Now, point 6 is actually really just a continuation of point 5. It's making the point that there does seem to be quite a low amount of water coming off from the comet compared to what you would get in your typical solar system comet. So typically in the solar system, comets' activity, the halo, the coma, the tail, is driven by water. So water ice warming up as it approaches the sun and then sublimating directly into gas, which then drives material off the comet and which is then pushed away by the solar wind and the solar light pressure and gives you the tail. In this particular object, it seems more likely that it's carbon dioxide that's actually doing most of the sublimation and therefore producing the activity of the comet. So again, that is interesting, and again, it's probably expected if you have a comet from a different star system that potentially it's formed either at a different distance from its sun or it formed at a different time when there was a different ratio of things like carbon and oxygen around in the star system, and so you get different mixtures of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and water being formed. So it's not shocking that they're different, but in this case, it's also important to note that this is not particularly crazy because there are solar system, or at least one solar system comet, which has an even more extreme ratio or lack of water than 3I Atlas. So there's this object called C2016R2, which, as the figure shows, is considerably even more extreme than 3I Atlas. So really he's sort of stealing one here by splitting what should actually be one point into two separate points, both of which boil down to the chemical element ratios look odd compared to solar system comets. We fully expect that this thing came from a different star system. None of the weird ratios that he's pointing out directly show any evidence of alien intelligence in being involved. I don't know why an alien intelligence would be mostly outgassing CO2 versus water as it passed through a star system, for example. Point number 7 is that the comet shows some extreme negative polarization. That is, the way it's reflecting light has essentially a preferred direction. Now, it is true that this object does have a quite extreme negative polarization, at least compared to solar system comets. The interesting thing, actually, is if we look at 2I Borisov, the second interstellar object that was ever discovered, it had an extreme positive polarization. So what this polarization measurement is probably telling you about is more about the diversity of the materials that are making up these different comets, based on whether you're from the solar system or you're from the solar system that Borisov came from, or the solar system that Atlas came from. We're actually seeing something about the diversity of the materials that went into these different comets. And so it's an area of really interesting active research. But again, it doesn't point to anything sinister. It just seems to be telling us something potentially very interesting and informative about how different star systems form different comets, effectively. Now, the final piece of evidence that Loeb relies on is the fact that if you track back where 3i Atlas comes from on the sky, you will find that it came from a point in the constellation of Sagittarius, which was within about 9 degrees of the famous WOW signal. So for those not familiar, the WOW signal was a radio transmission picked up by the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence back in 1977. And it bore some of the hallmarks of a radio transmission which was sent by an intelligent life form. Now, since it was first detected, there's been no repetition of that signal. It has not been able to decipher what it could mean. And, since time has gone on, people have mostly kind of come to the conclusion that it's got a more prosaic explanation, like a reflected human signal or some other phenomenon in deep space, which just sort of mimics an intelligence signal. On top of that, the fact that 3i Atlas comes from vaguely in that direction, it's not really telling you a lot. 9 degrees on the sky is a very large area. And if you're talking about 9 degrees pointed towards the center of our galaxy, there's probably tens, hundreds of millions of stars contained within that 9-degree circle. So it didn't come particularly close to that object. And also it just is another sign of this sort of statistical sort of cherry picking. Yes, it came within 9 degrees of the WOW signal, but how did they figure that out? Well, almost certainly what they did was worked out the trajectory of 3i Atlas and then asked the question, what is along that line of sight? What's near there? And they just found that the WOW signal was quite close to that. But, there's a lot of other things on the sky it could have been correlated with. Why weren't they checking the chance that it was correlated with the exact galactic center? Why aren't they checking the chance that it wasn't correlated with some sort of star that we know has exoplanets in, or something like a star cluster? Or why are they not saying, well, it's, not close to anything like Proxima Centauri, the nearest star system to Earth? It's essentially just cherry picking the nearest thing that's interesting to its. Okay, so that was a rundown of the 8 reasons why Loeb believes that 3i Atlas may have an extraterrestrial intelligence origin. Now, if you've been paying attention, you will have seen that at least 3 of those reasons come down to some very suspect sort of ad hoc or post hoc even statistical shenanigans. I don't think any of them particularly hold any water. Another 3 of the reasons are actually really only 2 reasons, but 3 of them, as how he defines them, are just due to the comet having slightly different properties to what is seen for the average solar system comet. And that isn't particularly compelling because we expect this thing to be different to solar system comets. It came from a different star system, formed at a different time, and has probably been wandering through the galaxy for potentially billions of years at this point. It would be amazing if it arrived at our solar system looking indistinguishable from a solar system comet. Then we have the idea that the comet displaying an anti-tail is signs of an alien presence. That also doesn't hold water, not least because Loeb himself has written a paper explaining it using nothing but natural phenomena. So if it can be explained by a natural phenomenon, why do we need to invoke aliens to explain it? It's not a particularly unusual phenomenon. It's seen in solar system comets. So let's just rely on good old-fashioned physics rather than requiring aliens. And then finally, the other reason he gives, which is that this object is massive compared to the two previous interstellar objects. I'll be honest, I just don't get how this is meant to provide evidence that this thing is the result of aliens. If anything, you want to have your spacecraft weigh less, not more. So the fact that it is of a mass range which is completely consistent with solar system comets, it's just a bit more massive than the two interlopers we've seen so far. I can't really see that as a compelling argument for this thing being alien. So, as you can tell, I am thoroughly not convinced that this thing is alien. I think by the vast preponderance of evidence, it's going to turn out to be just another comet, a very interesting one from another star system, and hopefully we'll be able to use it to learn something about how planetary systems form, giving us a sample other than just one, our own solar system. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts or comments or questions, please just leave them in the comments and I will try and respond as I can.